There is a silent threshold hidden in every human life, a place that cannot be mapped or measured, a sacred divide between who you once were and who you're meant to become, and no one crosses that line without suffering. Pain is not the enemy. Pain is the altar. It is the fire through which the false self burns and the true self is born. You don't become unbreakable by avoiding the flames. You become unbreakable by walking through them and refusing to come out the same. Modern culture has sedated us. It teaches us to fear discomfort, to flee from uncertainty, to anesthetize every ache with dopamine and distraction. But that is not life. That is slow death with entertainment. Look deeper. Behind every heartbreak, every betrayal, every rejection, there is a mirror, and what it shows is terrifying. It reflects not who they are, but who you are not yet brave enough to become. The world does not wound you to destroy you, it wounds you to awaken you. Carl Jung wrote, "Only the wounded physician heals." And he was right. The pain you've survived is the same pain that will shape your power. The hurt becomes the hammer. The sorrow becomes the sculptor. And every scar you carry becomes part of your crown if you let it. But only if you stop resisting the lesson inside the wound. You see, every pain is a rite of spiritual passage. Not because suffering is noble in itself, but because what you do with your suffering determines the shape of your soul. You can become bitter, or you can become wise. You can shrink into victimhood or rise into vision. And here's the truth they never taught you in school. Your anger, your sadness, your heartbreak, they are ancient signals. Archetypal energies buried deep in your unconscious. They emerge not to ruin you, but to guide you, to point you toward the places within that have not yet been claimed by your courage. This is symphoria, the ecstatic agony of psychological awakening. When your illusions collapse, when your beliefs are shattered, when your comfort dies, and all that's left is the raw, unfiltered truth of who you really are, you are not breaking down. You are being initiated. Every spiritual tradition knew this. The shaman descends into madness. The hero walks into the underworld. The mystic is stripped of all they cling to. This is not mythology, it is your life. And you have a choice to make. You can continue numbing, denying, blaming, or you can face the fire and step into it with eyes wide open, knowing that on the other side of that burn is the birth of something immortal. But to do that, you must abandon the shallow mindset that seeks comfort over clarity. Mindset is not a buzzword. It is a lens through which you interpret suffering. A weak mindset says, "Why is this happening to me?" A powerful one says, "What part of me is this here to awaken?" Because nothing happens to you. Everything happens for the purpose of your evolution, if you're willing to extract meaning from the madness. You are not the thoughts that loop in panic. You are not the emotion that floods your chest. You are the observer behind it all. And the more you root yourself in that awareness, the less power external chaos holds over your internal peace. This is the beginning of mastery, the end of reacting, the rise of response. Once you realize that your pain is not a punishment but a passage, everything changes. You stop seeing people as threats. You stop arguing with life. You stop begging for ease. And you start embracing the difficulty as divine instruction. Belief becomes your compass. Not the shallow belief of positive thinking or forced affirmations, but the deep, visceral knowing that life is for you even when it hurts like hell. Your belief shapes your biology. It shifts your nervous system, your decisions, your destiny. And if your belief system is built on fear, you will interpret every pain as proof that you are cursed. But if it is built on truth, you will see every wound as evidence that you are chosen. Clarity follows belief. When the fog of fear lifts, what remains is the path. Not always easy, not always linear, but unmistakable. Most people are lost not because life is unclear, but because they are unwilling to see what the pain is pointing to. They don't want to admit that their misery is familiar, that their chaos is chosen, that their suffering serves their identity. But once you are willing to let go of who you think you are, clarity rushes in like floodwater. You remember what you forgot, that your soul is ancient, that your spirit is unbreakable, and that nothing and no one has ever had the power to define you. Only you. And from that clarity comes vision, not a 5-year plan or a career goal, but a soul-deep conviction about what you are here to embody. Not everyone will understand it. Not everyone is meant to. Vision isolates before it elevates. That is the cost of purpose. Because before you become the healer, the warrior, the leader, you must walk alone. You must bleed alone. You must sit in the silence and let the pain carve you into something more honest than ambition and more sacred than success. This is where purpose is forged, not in pleasure, not in applause, but in the crucible of your darkest nights. The question is not, do I have a purpose? The question is, am I willing to suffer for something greater than my ego? If the answer is yes, discipline becomes devotion. Discipline is not restriction, it is resurrection. It is the daily act of returning to who you really are, despite the voice in your head that still wants to run. And when that voice screams, when it tells you to quit, to hide, to numb, that is when you act. Action kills fear. Action reclaims power. Action builds the bridge between who you were and who you are becoming. But it must be rooted in gratitude. Gratitude not just for what feels good, but for the pain itself, for the teacher hidden inside the trauma, for the divine intelligence that wrapped your lesson in a wound. The moment you can thank your pain is the moment you are no longer its prisoner. You adapt, you evolve, you rise. Adaptability is the soul's secret weapon. It's not about being okay with everything. It's about transmuting everything, turning betrayal into wisdom, turning grief into strength, turning silence into a song that only the healed can sing. And from there, resilience blooms, not the fake kind that pretends nothing hurts, but the sacred resilience of someone who knows they can survive anything because they already have. And now you learn, not just from books, but from your blood, from your bruises, from the nights you thought would kill you, and the mornings you chose to rise anyway. This is the path, not comfort, not certainty, but courage. The courage to walk through every rite of passage, not with fear, but with reverence. Because every pain, every loss, every tear is not a punishment, it is a calling. And your soul is ready to answer. When God wrestled Jacob in the darkness, it was not to punish him, it was to transform him. Genesis 32 tells us of a man who, alone in the night, was broken and blessed in the same breath. He touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched, and yet Jacob emerged with a new name, Israel. Not because he ran from pain, but because he embraced it, wrestled with it, and let it change him. This is not myth, this is blueprint. The limp he carried wasn't weakness. It was the mark of a man who met God in his suffering and survived. That limp was his crown. And the same is true for you. The heartbreak that shattered your plans, that was your river Jabbok. The betrayal that humiliated you, that was your divine wrestling match. The anxiety that gripped your chest at 3 a.m., making you question your worth. That was God pressing his hand against your hip, whispering, you will not walk into the next chapter unchanged. For whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, just as a father disciplines the son in whom he delights. Proverbs 3:12. We live in a generation that wants the blessing without the bruise, the resurrection without the cross. But the word of God is clear. Pain precedes purpose. The cross came before the crown. Think of Joseph, sold by his brothers, thrown into a pit, left in prison for years because someone lied. And yet through it all, he never lost the clarity of his vision. When he stood before the same brothers who betrayed him, he said, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis 50-20. That is what spiritual maturity looks like. The ability to see God's fingerprints on the very blade that wounded you. Joseph didn't seek revenge. He didn't need to, because he understood that every betrayal was a part of the divine orchestration of his destiny. If the pit had not happened, the palace would have never come. Some of you are cursing the pit, but the pit is the passage. And if you look deeper, you'll see it's not just biblical, it's universal. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison. They tried to bury him, erase him, crush his will. But when he emerged, he said, "I came out mature, not bitter, mature." The pain purified his character. It sharpened his vision. It built the kind of inner power that no regime could touch. You don't build that kind of strength through comfort. You build it when you are stripped of everything, your reputation, your approval, your security, and all that's left is the naked truth of your own soul. Pain doesn't lie. It reveals. It shows you who was loyal. It shows you what's worth fighting for. It shows you the idols you built, titles, money, control, image, and it smashes them so something eternal can rise from the dust. That's what happened with Job, one of the wealthiest, most righteous men of his time. And yet God allowed everything to be taken: his wealth, his children, his health, not to destroy him, but to refine him. And when Job questioned, when he wept, when he raged, God did not rebuke him for feeling. He answered him not with comfort, but with clarity. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Job 38:4. In that moment, Job realized his suffering was not random. It was sacred. His wounds were not a sign of God's absence. They were the very place God chose to reveal his voice. So, stop asking why you are in pain. Start asking what it's here to reveal. Because every single time someone breaks you, it's an invitation to break open, to release the ego, to dissolve the illusions, to awaken the warrior that's been sleeping under your skin. Think of David. Before he became king, he was hunted by Saul, lied about, driven into exile, forced to hide in caves. And it was in those caves, not the palace, where he wrote the Psalms that still move the world today. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Psalm 23:4. David didn't write that after victory. He wrote that while running for his life, because faith forged in the valley is stronger than any doctrine memorized on the mountaintop. And here's what nobody tells you: the higher your calling, the deeper your pain. Because God doesn't build warriors in sunlight. He builds them in the shadows. He doesn't train leaders with applause. He trains them with abandonment. He doesn't awaken your spirit with luxury. He awakens it with loss. So if you're hurting, if you're aching, if you feel like everything is falling apart, take heart. You're not being punished. You're being purified. You're not being forgotten. You're being forged. Every delay is divine. Every closed door is redirection. Every heartbreak is alignment. And soon, if you refuse to fold, your wounds will become weapons. You'll speak from a place that people feel in their bones. You'll walk into rooms and shift the atmosphere without saying a word. You'll carry the authority of someone who's walked through hell and brought back light. But not if you run from the pain, not if you medicate it and you suppress it. You have to meet it head on, with trembling hands and open eyes. You have to look the wound in the face and say, I know you came to change me. I know you're the price for the fire I asked for. I know you're not the end, you're the threshold. And then you walk forward, not because it's easy, not because you're ready, but because God is with you in the fire. And when God is in the fire, the flames don't destroy you, they set you free. There's a silence that descends when everything external fails you. Not the silence of peace, but of exposure. You find yourself staring into the void of who you thought you were. Your identity, once wrapped in people, positions, and praise, now stripped bare. And that's when it hits you. You never really knew yourself. You only knew your reflection in the approval of others. And when that mirror shatters, when every validation disappears, what remains is not emptiness. It's the raw space of rebirth. It's the opportunity to reconstruct your self-concept from a place untouched by flattery or failure, to rebuild not on sand, but on stone. This is what the wilderness was for. Moses spent 40 years tending sheep in Midian, not to be forgotten, but to be refashioned. He was once a prince, fluent in Egyptian power, but to lead a nation through the desert, he first had to become a man of silence, a man who didn't react to noise but listened to God. That wilderness wasn't punishment, it was preparation. And in your own life, isolation often arrives right before elevation. Don't misread the silence. Don't interpret solitude as insignificance. Sometimes God clears the crowd not to curse you, but to consecrate you. Because as long as you are surrounded by noise, your identity will be influenced by it. But in the wilderness, when all you have is stillness, that's when the voice of God grows loud enough to separate your calling from your conditioning. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. Stillness is not stagnation. It is spiritual recalibration. It's where the false attachments dissolve the need to be liked, the addiction to results, the obsession with proving yourself. And what takes their place is conviction, not the kind born from pride, but from communion. When you emerge from silence with that kind of inner anchoring, you move differently. You don't chase, you don't convince, you don't perform. You carry presence, the kind that's earned in the dark, the kind that comes not from having answers, but from having endured. And the world can feel it. They sense it in your pauses, in your gaze, in the way you hold tension without flinching. You become dangerous, not in aggression, but in clarity. Because nothing is more threatening to systems of control than someone who no longer needs to be controlled. Someone who's been through fire, had every identity burned away, and came back not needing anything but ready to give everything. That's what happened to Jesus in the wilderness. Before he performed a single miracle, before he taught a single parable, he went into solitude. He fasted. He faced temptation not with physical might, but with sacred memory. It is written, he didn't argue with darkness. He didn't explain himself to the adversary. He simply stood in the truth he already carried, and the enemy left. That is the power of identity rooted in the eternal, not the emotional. When you know who you are in God, no slander can shake you. No rejection can define you. No failure can end you. You become what Scripture calls a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Psalm 1-3. But to reach that level of spiritual rootedness, something must first be severed. Your loyalty to your lesser self, the version of you that keeps playing small to be accepted, that keeps shrinking to maintain false peace, that keeps betraying your own voice just to keep someone else comfortable. That self must die, not as an act of cruelty, but of creation. Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed, but if it dies, it produces many seeds. John 12:24. The death of the false self is the birthplace of abundance, but it requires ruthless honesty. It requires you to stop blaming your pain on others and start interrogating the parts of you that allowed it, not from shame, but from sovereignty. You tolerated disrespect because part of you still needed external validation. You allowed manipulation because your boundaries were built on fear of abandonment. You stayed silent because the inner child still believed love had to be earned. And now it's time to evolve. This is not about becoming stronger in the superficial sense. It's about becoming whole. Strength without wholeness is just ego in armor. But wholeness is sacred. It is soft and unbreakable at once. It's when your yes means yes and your no needs no explanation. It's when you stop reacting to projection and start living from intention. It's when your presence alone becomes instruction, and people either rise or retreat in response to your energy, because they can feel that you're no longer playing human games. You're walking in divine rhythm. And when you move like that, aligned, undistracted, unoffended, life unfolds differently. You don't beg for signs. You recognize patterns. You don't force doors. You walk through the ones that open in peace. You don't fear endings, you honor them. Because endings are not exits, they are edits, sacred edits, cleansing your life of what was never aligned with your elevation. Even Jesus, let people leave. He turned to the 12 and said, do you also want to go away? John 6-67, he didn't cling, he didn't chase, he let the misaligned walk, not because he lacked compassion, but because he had clarity. And that is your next spiritual threshold, the courage to let go of what is no longer aligned with the truth of who you are becoming. Not in resentment, but in reverence. Let go of the roles you played to survive. Let go of the masks you wore to belong. Let go of the narratives that kept you safe but small, because you were not born to be manageable, you were born to be miraculous. And miracles do not happen in comfort zones. They happen at the edge where your faith is louder than your fear and your obedience stronger than your opinions. They happen when you step into unfamiliar waters, not knowing if the sea will split, but trusting that even if it doesn't, your feet will find a way. And when you walk like that, heaven responds. Not always with answers, but always with alignment. The path will not be easy, but it will be worth every scar. Because when you live like this, grounded in truth, rooted in silence, led by spirit, you don't just survive pain. You alchemizate. You rise as a living altar, proof that God still turns ashes into beauty, that he still speaks through broken vessels, that he still anoints those willing to wrestle in the dark. And when people look at you, they'll know, this one has been touched by fire, this one walks with God. And now you stand at the edge, not of a new beginning, but of a final shedding. The old self, the one addicted to comfort, approval, distraction, tugs at your ankles like a dying ghost, begging to be remembered. But your spirit, your true self, has already begun to rise. Not in a burst of lightning, not in applause, but in quiet, steady conviction. You are no longer waiting for life to give you permission. You are no longer bargaining with pain, hoping it leaves you alone. You see it now for what it is, your greatest teacher, your most sacred forge. Because what you lost wasn't your life, it was your illusion. What you buried wasn't your worth, it was your mask. And what you feared was not death, it was birth. The rebirth of your soul, clear-eyed, open-handed, unshakable. You carry in your bones what they cannot teach in schools, sell in seminars, or mimic in media. You carry the wisdom of walking through pain with your eyes wide open, of letting God meet you in the ruins and speak life into dust. This is why you're still standing. Not because you were spared, but because you were chosen. Every tear you cried watered the roots of your transformation. Every betrayal refined the precision of your discernment. Every silence you endured taught you to hear the voice of God more clearly than the noise of men. And now you are dangerous, not because you harm, but because you cannot be deceived. You see through performance, you see through manipulation, you see through the counterfeit, because you've paid the price of authenticity. And it cost you everything, but what you gained was yourself, your real self, the one God envisioned before the world taught you to be afraid, before trauma taught you to be small, before betrayal taught you to harden. No, you walk with softness that cannot be broken. You speak with fire that cannot be quenched. You live with a purpose that cannot be bought, because you've come through the right. You've passed through the fire, and you carry its light now not as a spotlight, but as a torch, not to impress, not to convert, but to illuminate the path for the next soul trembling in darkness. This is legacy, not what you build, not what you own, but who you become. And when your final breath comes, let it be said, here lies someone who did not run, who did not hide, who met their pain, their God, and their destiny with arms wide open. Let the world remember your ashes, because from them something eternal rose. And it was you.